The general topic that I want to address is more watershed assessment and how we deal with different types of disturbance. Assessment in general, as it relates to watersheds, has relied on forestry industry going in to do a planned disturbance over time, in particular watersheds, until recently, I guess. Large fires, mountain pine beetle, other disturbances on the land base have really made our job a little more difficult. These are things, as you pointed out, are we looking at trying to develop ECA curves for mountain pine beetle, or should we? Perhaps those are questions as a collective hydrology group we've been trying to discuss. Those are the kind of the topics I'd like to go through in this last 45 minutes or so before we have a discussion, a more broader discussion. Or if you want, feel free to jump in at points and ask questions. I'm completely open for that. So before I did this, I wanted a definition of what an assessment was. And I looked at a variety of different ones. And this one's actually from the US, under the US legislation. And I've got a couple of them. And all I wanted to do, there's a lot of words, but I put the ones in red that I actually want you to read because I realized it'd be after lunch. So the idea behind predictions or behind assessments or analysis in other areas is this really comes down to this idea of predicting what a plan might do so that decision makers can make an informed decision as to what are the pros and cons of a particular plan as it relates to an environmental impact. And then you like how some people say both beneficial and adverse, because some people want to say impacts are good and some are bad. And we've heard a lot about that today with Aldous Sellens talking about, and Amy talking about water quantity and flow, others talking about, or Aldous talking about impacts to quantity, and then Brooks coming in with sort of a temperature focus, which is another water quality issue that really hasn't been highlighted too much through here. This talk and this whole sort of mountain pine beetle approach is primarily focused on hydrology, so change in flows, not necessarily those other ones. So this would apply if we were talking about sediment or phosphorus or nitrogen or carbon or temperature or other types of watershed attributes. But the focus of this talk, because the topic was hydrology, I put towards hydrology. It tends to be the one that is a little more, although some of the water quality things can be subtle and interesting, this one tends to be a little more black box and confusing. So that it's a good one to focus on as it relates to mountain pine beetle. One of the ones that I like to take a look at as it relates to what is an assessment is generally it's defining a risk. So there's some sort of consequence if something bad happens, and then there's some sort of likelihood or hazard that something might happen. And so when we're assessing a plan or a natural disturbance or some sort of impact, what we want to do is try and figure out what is that likelihood of a change that might have a consequence and define a risk. And I'll go through a few of these. And often we're not the decision makers. Actually, I don't think I've ever been considered a decision maker in my life, other than maybe once. We tend to be informing people on the risk. So our assessments are not intended to define what the due course is forward, but more or less to highlight and understand what this risk are, so that decision makers can either accept that risk or make modifications to whatever decision they have to make. That's really the focus of a lot of this. It's not what is right and wrong, it's what is the different potential risk associated with different decisions. So the context is really important, and I wanted to throw this in. A lot of people have probably seen this, but the context in where you do this in the planning process or in a rehabilitation process is important to the genesis behind the different types of tools used in assessments. So what I've used this to explain to others how you get to a cut block in Alberta. And this is obviously messed up. So in order to get there, you need a tenure, which then gives you a forest management plan. Without those, you can't go in the forest. Part of this forest management plan in Alberta is a spatial harvest sequence, and we'll come back to this because this is a little bit important. But for those of you not in forestry, this is generally a 20-year spatial representation of a long-term plan. So it's a spatial plan that the forest companies are going to go out and follow, and it's 20 years in length. It generally looks like this. So here's our quadrants in different colors. Your 0 to 5, 5 to 10 that we're going to go harvest. And they're polygons chosen by a computer generally that represents a long-term sustainable forest plan. Then you have this general development plan, which I'm not sure exactly what it's for, But you get a final harvest plan, which is the detailed stuff that's going to go on the ground. I do know what it's for, but I'm just gonna do it. Which is where the roads are going to be, where the buffers are, all these, where the blocks are. Usually this is either hung with ribbons, someone's gone out in the field to look at it, or it's so simple that there's a line of another cut block, we're not hanging ribbons. The buncher operator can't get lost or he's fired. Then you get an annual operating plan. So with the tenure and the annual operating plan, you can go do this to a forest. If not, you end up in jail, I think is or fine. Then there's these other little aspects. So ground rules, there's some other legislation out there. Some of it's federal, some of it's provincial. So the whole point of this whole thing is it depends on where you do your assessment. So if you're doing your assessment at your snapshot before you go out and look at a particular watershed, you need a certain bit of information as it relates to predictions of what might happen into the future. If you're dealing with a 20-year or longer time frame, you need a different level of information as it relates to what might happen to those stands as you march through time. So this is, we're going out to lay out, we need to know what's out there now so we don't adversely hurt something. This is a plan that's going to do stuff into the future. So we need to know as we harvest things or things regrow or we rehabilitate things, what's going to happen into the future for those stands. So it's a different approach. And where these assessments and analysis have come from within legislation has dictated the different tools that different jurisdictions have used. And it's important as we get through this a little bit further. I'll bring it back. So that's the context of where it happens. I want to go back to this idea of consequence and hazard or likelihood. So this is a watershed that we did something to. Well, actually, we didn't do it. Forest Company did, but we wanted them to do that. Perhaps we could put it like that. Anyway, so this is a forest hydrology experiment. Before we're going to do this, we need to know what might be around there. So this is down at the bottom. Here's some guy and a road and a community and a bunch of other things. So there's some consequence to changing the hydrology associated with this water, or with this watershed. And apparently, it was a good thing Aldous did their fish sampling before this happened, but apparently there's a federally listed fish species downstream in this as well. So there's another consequence associated, whether it's legal or ethical, associated with potentially changing the hydrology associated with this. So those consequences. We'll get back to the potential change in a minute. Here's another one that Aldous has talked about as well. So this is the Elbow River watershed that runs down through here, through Brad Creek, and then into Calgary. So potential consequences of hydrology changing there. There's the reservoir with the drinking water utility, which others have brought this up. So if there's a large fire, a large mountain pine beetle epidemic, Forest Company got excited, something happened, there potentially could be consequences to this reservoir and something that maybe we're far enough away from Calgary, but we remember that there were floods, so here's the stampede grounds underwater. They're just off the corner down there too. So there's real or perceived, there's consequences to changing the hydrology associated with this. So if we park that and we talk about what does forest condition affect from a hydrology perspective, or what potentially could be affected. So we've been throwing around a lot of words, hydrologic words, which probably mean quite a bit different things to people in this room, depending on your background or where you've heard them or if you've even heard them. So I've thrown up a few of them here. So the idea of yield. So the idea of how much water you get over a time period. So you can have a monthly yield, you can have a seasonal yield, you can have an annual yield. So how much water do you get in a year, a month, a season? Those are terms that we use a lot. Peak flow. So these are small, medium, large. So these are things that you see. So water rises up, you get a peak, and then it goes past. Some of them are average. You might see every year. Some of them are floods that you might see once every 100 years, on average. They're statistics. Low flows, so the opposite of this. Normal low flows. So if you were to go out there now, most of the streams would be a low flow. A drought might be something that politicians get a little more upset about. And then there's things that Aldous talked about, timing. So there's this concept of timing. So you can shift the timing of when a peak comes, or you can shift the timing of when a snow melt starts. One of the things that we didn't really talk about, but within forest hydrology in general, we talked a lot about shifting of the melt peak. But this idea of reduced storage capacity is a very important part of a lot of hydrology in different worlds. So as you go through the summer into the rains into the fall, if your forest has been transpiring, you have a fair bit of storage capacity. If you haven't, when those rains comes, that storage capacity may actually affect the timing. It may not affect your peak flow, but you may end up with more water with less of a buffer associated with it, more change in storage. So these are conceptual ideas that affect these different types of hazards or consequences, or sorry, likelihood of something different happening. So what I wanted to do is show a couple of slides from the literature that just sort of illustrate what these things are, generally, that we burn. So this one is the McClure fire. So Brett Eaton and company a few years ago published a paper primarily looking at what happened to the stream morphology, but they also presented a lot of information on the hydrology. And what they have here is all these little pale dots is everything from 1970, I think, to 2007, before the fire, same. And then all the dark symbols are post-fire. And you can see a very dramatic change in the timing of this peak. Not necessarily in the magnitude, but the timing. And in some of them, there's actually a double peak. So McClure fire is just north of Kamloops, burned about half of the watershed, and what they attributed this double peak action to is this water coming from the burn section and this water coming from the other portion. So half the watershed is much quicker than the other half, which is over here. So the argument is, what happens if we burn the whole thing and we actually move this portion over here too? Would it be bigger? So their argument with this one is somewhat of a muted response, because they took half the watershed that would normally respond here in this big one and put it there. So a desynchronization of the peak. It's kind of a neat example. There's not a whole bunch of sciencey stuff behind it, but it's shown quite clearly with these plots. And Aldous mentioned this a little bit, kind of alluded to it, but didn't want to bite into it. So we used similar methodology as it relates to modeling. So it's modeling. Don't really want to bite into it too much. But we did the same stuff with data from Aldous's site. And when we do that with the McClure fire, we see a very obvious signal associated with the fire. When we do it to the landscape, that the only thing we could have done worse was pave it, I think you said. In the east slopes, we can't seem to detect that signal. So there's this, what's going on with these east slopes / foothills watersheds. It's not just us, there's others that have sort of found this trend as well. So here's an example of not of land use change, but because this is supposed to be breaking news, Amy just talked about this on Monday, so I stole her slide. So this is breaking news. So this is talking about, does anybody know what PDO stands for? Yeah, so it's a phase shift in the ocean temperatures, which affects the type and the amount of precip and the temperature where we live. Who knew? Okay, so paired catchment studies are a major part of where we get a lot of our information from hydrology. A lot of them were done in the hydrologic decade, which spanned the 1970s. In 1977, there was a PDO shift. And what happened was there was a shift in the amount of winter precipitation, but also the temperature associated with it. So what Amy has plotted here is the control of one of our paired watershed studies that we'll talk about a little bit later. And you can actually see a stark difference post 1977 in the onset of the snowmelt, and then all the way into the fall, the raininess associated with it. So before 1977, colder, much more snow, and you get this later kind of snowmelt signal in Tri Creeks, which is just west of Rock. The shift in PDO shift, and it does less snow, but with an onset of melt quicker and more rain into that. So if we were to look at this, which I think Aldous pointed out in the committee meeting, if we were to look at this, this is what we'd expect without harvest, and this is what we would expect with harvest. So there's a good chance that the harvest in the paired catchment study was completely canceled out by the PDO shift. I don't know if everybody cares about that, but I think it's pretty cool. And if you see a bunch of old academics get excited in the committee meeting, it's always fun. You see Kevin Beetle's eyes light up when he's looking at that graph. Anyway, so the other word that I highlighted was prediction. So the idea of prediction, and we're going to talk about this concept of ECA and some of these other ones, and I'm going to beat on models for a little bit. So this idea of prediction, often it's not done yet, or even if it is done yet, it's uncertain of what's going to happen. Fire went through, okay, well, we need to predict what that fire might do to these water values, these hydrologic values. We're going to do a forest harvest plan, what might be happening. So I've broken this out quite simply. There's really two ways you could do it. One is you could model it, and I'll talk about this a little bit, or conversely, you could use indicators and sort of professional judgment, asking questions around what is the watershed, how does it work, where is it? Some of these concepts that we've been talking about a lot this morning already and into this afternoon from an ecological perspective. So this is less relying on the computer to do it, and more relying on indicators associated with it, like the equivalent Clearcut area, which we'll talk about here. So modeling. Keith was telling me a story this morning about these things. So he was trying to get the computer to print these out last night, and he said he ruined a stack of things, of little Post-it things, trying to get the margins right on the printer. It just wouldn't line up properly. And I was thinking about that at lunchtime. And what is hydrologic modeling? Hydrologic modeling is doing this, trying to get this to print out right with a computer. So what you do is you take the input signal, which is rain, snow, temperature, maybe a few other ones depending on what type of modeling you have, and an output signal, which is stream flow, and you put them in, let's see if I got a picture. No, I don't have a picture yet. We'll get to it. You put them into a computer with a bunch of equations, and you try to make the input look like the output. That's it. Tweak some knobs, do some stuff, and it makes it's kind of like trying to get on my picture. It's supposed to look like this, but it comes out and it's off. So you got to adjust your margins. So that's computer modeling. All right. So Tri Creeks. We were talking about Tri Creeks. Tri Creeks, just west of Robb. We've seen a lot of pictures of Robb, south of Hinton, very close up into the foothills. Very classic foothills watershed. It was harvested. It was part of this fish forestry experiment. So what they did, they left one watershed alone. They harvested 36% of one, and I think it was 37% of the other watershed. One of them, they harvested all the buffers close to the stream. One of them, they harvested a little farther away. So the whole idea was, what happens to the poor fish when you log all the buffers? I don't know if it was ever really conclusive on that, but it makes a great hydrologic study to look at what happens in a backy design as you do that type of treatment associated with these. And I just mentioned, part of the reason was that the PDO shift was not just to show you that watersheds can be impacted by climate and weather, but the fact that the PDO shift messes with our data associated with this. So it gives us a hard time. So what do? Here we go. We try to make some, so here, water temperature, water comes in, goes through this thing, that thing, oh, and it comes over here, surface flow. So this is Amy's pain of existence. I think she went to BC Hydro and Waterloo to try and learn how to use this thing, and finally she's got it working great, so we're going to present some of her results here soon. But this is hydrologic modeling generally. It's a fairly complex, and this is a simple one. It's a fairly complex system that you need to really know what you're going on, and if you unless you have this and this, what do you have? So if you don't have surface water flow data for your watershed, you don't have temperature, you don't have precipitation, you're back to sort of professional judgment and trying to use one of these things. So this is the science part, and this is Amy's bit. This isn't Amy's. This is Nick Zerg's work from Oregon. But this is what she was supposed to produce, and I'll explain this briefly, and then we'll move on to hers. So what this is a hydrologic model that was calibrated. So we took the input, made it look like the output for the pre-disturbance portion. Then they built a road, and then they harvested the block, and then it runs through here. And this is the difference between the output from the hydrologic model and the real observed data. So you can see the variation in this red line that they put on here to help you see what's going on. It's very small, and then they harvest it. So the difference between the model output and the real data starts to deviate. So you see this timing shift and the peak flow shift. So there's more water and sooner predicted, or in reality than would be predicted if it was still forest. So it behaves the way you'd expect. And they did this because they had similar problems that we do. The PDO shift, just can't keep the watersheds the same. The trees grow back, the climate's not the same this year versus that year. These are very difficult things to actually tease out what might be going on, so we rely on models to do that. When Amy does this, so here's Amy's, for one where they removed all the buffers and one where they just did normal 1970s, 80s clearcut harvesting, you can see there isn't much of a difference. So you don't see this stark change. So this sort of reinforces this potential weight evidence of what's happening in our east slopes and our foothills watersheds when we have more water. And wait, there's another one here. I'm gonna harass you with this one more time because this is just kind of fun. So, oh, sorry, we'll get there. So the idea of how would we incorporate this information? So this was really going to be Amy's next step. She has all this wonderful stand level information when she presented some of the water balances. So she can have real good confidence on what happens if you harvest versus kill some of it, all that kind of stuff. You can use that model and change these attributes to look at scenarios to see what happens if all the pine dies or you harvest 90% of it, or you can play with these types of things. That is, provided you have confidence that your model is working for the right reason. So how you would do this is you would calibrate the model like I talked about, tweak some knobs, make the input look like the output, and then you would change the condition based on some information. And Amy, believe me or not, has some of the best that you would ever do an experiment like this with. Normally we just make it up out of the literature. She's actually gone out and measured this in great detail with good information on what might happen to these pine stands. The problem is it working for the right reason? And we call this equifinality within the hydrologic world, because Keith Bevan, who's the guy that invented the name, likes big names, I guess. So there's two ways that we deal with it. One is physically based, which I won't talk about at all, but this is models that are based on physics, not on conceptual ideas. Or the other way that we could build confidence is actually test the model with pre and post disturbance data. So see if it does the same thing. And this is the one where I really wanted to show where it's kind of neat. So what Amy did was run the model with the pre-disturbance and the post-disturbance and let the model decide what the parameters should be. So rather than tuning it with her hand, use an algorithm that says, what is the best set of parameters for it? And if you were to do this in the real world, you'd expect it would mess around with these parameters, because that's what in the real world you're doing. You're cutting the trees. You're not playing with the soil. But what the model did was made the soil deeper. So the model realized there was more water there, but didn't want to put it in the stream. So it hit it and then pumped it back into the atmosphere. So the model tricked us. So this is a long, kind of cool, breaking news story to say that if you're using a detailed hydrologic model, which it's too bad none of the environment modelers do, if you don't have this opportunity to use the pre-disturbed and post-disturbance data to test to see if it's working right under those different conditions, you have to be careful in analyzing your results. But none of you care because you don't do this for a living. Okay, so we'll rattle through this bit here too. So back to indicators. So that was sort of hydrologic modeling, and if you're in the realm of sort of the engineering firms, everybody's got their favorite model, and they like to do this because it reproduces what they want. It gives them numbers and error bars around it, and then you can force it with different scenarios. What happens if you make Calgary 10 times as big as it is now? Or what happens is everything burns? And we do this on a regular basis as well, but from an academic perspective, we like to make sure, well, we publish papers, but also to test the models themselves. As we get into indicators, this is more where the professional judgment comes in. And I put water yield in here because in Alberta, we use and have used water yield, average annual water yield, and I'll talk about that one first. What's been bandied around a lot is equivalent clearcut area, so I'll talk about that a little bit. And it's important that we understand some of these aspects associated with the watershed as we get these. We'll deal with that in a minute, I guess. I was going to talk. So this, went on our lovely website in the government that changed again, and it took me forever to find this stupid thing. I knew exactly where it was. I had the link. So this is the C5 management plan and appendix 6 something or other, which is the watershed assessment done by Rich Rothwell and company. Not that I'm picking on it, but he has these nice figures in the appendix of the appendix. And this one here is showing the water yield of Beaver Creek at Brock from 1921 to 2003. So this is every year you plot how much water came out of this watershed, and because we're hydrologists and we live in Alberta, the water year usually starts around now, when water that falls next week is going to come out next year. So we don't want to start it in January. So it's sort of an October to October time frame. And what the average annual water yield is the average of that. That's all it is. And why we use it is we generally assume flow, Q, equals precipitation, so what comes in, minus evapotranspiration that goes up, and then there's this change in storage. But because it's over the long term, there's change in storage, we just ignore it. We just figure, that kind of evens out in the end. So what we would do from a hydrologic perspective, or a forest hydrology perspective, is we have a pretty good idea what happens to this when we cut a pine stand down and then it starts to regrow. And I'll show you some data on that. So we take this and increase that. So if we were to take what Amy has, once she does a better job of understanding exactly what it was, if we were to update this process, we could take this information and figure out how 100% differs from a harvest, how the 50% differs from these. So we would be able to figure this out quite easily and modify that process. Too bad I didn't have any candies here. The problem that we've sort of been talking about is this thing. And what happens to that extra water? Does it actually go here, or does it stay there? So that's all I'm going to say about that one. Other than if we wanted to update that with the information that we're collecting at the ROB site, it would be some of the better data to be able to do it. It's giving us those numbers within that equation to be able to do a good job on that. And I'm glad I put this in here. I wasn't going to, but there's been a lot of talk today on this concept of equivalent clear-cut area. So back to the genesis of these. So this is BC's equivalent clear-cut area. Height and percent recovery. So 9 meters, it's 100, almost 100%. I don't think they wanted it to fully recover back in the 90s when they did this. I'm serious on it. I think they wanted it to just miss for some reason. And then 3 meters. Nice linear regression. And as far as I know, this comes from Rita Winkler, who's forest hydrologist in the Okanagan, plus other comrades who were, when they started their jobs, Rita did her master's, I think, at Tri Creeks before she went to BC. When she started her job, she hired people and went out and actually looked at different stands and measured the snow, how much there was and how fast it melted. So the start of the melt, how much there is and how fast it melted. And she noticed that there was a good relationship at 9 meters. It was the same as an old forest. And then they put this in a guidebook under their code days and it stuck. So this is equivalent clear cut of a stand in BC. As any good forester knows, we have many ways to determine height versus age of trees that may not, it's a good metric to be able to use this for different purposes. But that's really where this came. When we were looking for one in Alberta, similarly, so Sillins is here. I actually had to go dig this out. It took me a while to find his thesis. So Brendan's thesis, 2005, they were doing the same thing. So I should have shown the map, but it's all over sort of Nordegg north, all through pine stands, trying to find a relationship between some sort of tree metric and some sort of hydrologic metric that's important to us as hydrologists that would be sound. They didn't find height. They found current annual increment as it relates to leaf area index, but only for pine stands with a site index of 18 and above. Is that fair to say? This is quite late at night, and I just pulled the thesis down. But anyway, so we've used this rather than what Rita and others have found in BC. Primarily because, if you were awake when Amy was talking, BC's focused on snow melt and snow accumulation rate. We get a lot of our peak flows, our large flows, derived from rain in the May, June time. So is snow amount and melt rate important for our processes? I guess is an important question as we start to import some of these things based on how our systems work. So this idea of stand recovery, and I said this would be important at some point. So as hydrologists, depending on where we want to do our assessment, it matters. So if you're in British Columbia back in the day when you're doing this and you're given a map, you just need to know what's out there. You don't need to know what's going to happen in the future. Just here's what's there, and if you harvest this, this is likely going to be your impact. Rules of thumb that have been kicked around on a lot of these are these recovery curves. What we know as forest hydrologists, if you harvest a watershed, you're going to start to see responses to some of these indicators. And they start to happen around 25 to 30%. So depending on how risk adverse or confidence you are, some people would say don't harvest any more than 20% of the watershed. And another person might say don't harvest any more than 30% of the watershed. But it's in that range as far as what forest hydrologists would argue. And then some forester stood up and said, yeah, but these trees regrow. And I'm like, oh, crap. Okay, so then someone said, okay, do it in 2 passes. Make sure that you let it green up to about 20 years. And then, well, that wasn't enough because we're going into a sort of a spatial orientation. So lo and behold, we pull out something that Rita has. Here's a height limit from 3 meters to 7 meters where we can net down how much disturbance we have. So if you have a 6 meter high stand, it only counts 50% as if it was a fresh clear cut. Now you can sum up all these equivalent clear cut areas and tell you how much a disturbance on the watershed might be. That was really the idea behind it. In Alberta, we've really been focused on the prediction at this 20-year plan time frame. And in order to do that, we need to have what's going to happen over the next 20 years with this stand. We can't just go out and measure it and say what's the height and what's the potential equivalent to a fresh clear cut. We need to have some sort of prediction tool associated with that. And so this is where us as hydrologists have to talk to a silviculturalist or a growth and yield person to figure out how might this thing grow. Or conversely, if we're not going to do silviculture to it, I guess an ecologist. Is that the difference? Right? So if we're just going to leave it alone, or we're not actually going to do forestry to this thing or silviculture to this thing, it's kind of in the ecology bin. So this is where this discussion with the ecology on how will these stands recover. We talked a lot about watershed recovery. Brooks brought it up. Aldous talked about it a lot, and I'm glad you did. Because watershed recovery is very different than stand recovery. Stand recovery is standing in this pine stand, it's all dead, what's it going to look like in 10 years if I do A or B? That's the stand recovery. Watershed recovery is, oh my God, we just had the 2013 floods and now we have the recovery program of how many X millions of dollars to recover what just happened. So that's where you need the biologists, the geomorphologists, the engineers, everybody comes out to fix the watershed or to restore the watershed versus the stand. So these are quite different. And I didn't want to touch on watershed recovery, at least from my perspective. It was whether or not it's in that area where we might see adverse effects, and we're talking about hazard, not necessarily how will we fix it. That's a completely different aspect. We're talking about, as Brooks pointed out, planting trees to try and change the trajectory of a pine stand or a spruce stand. We're not talking about trying to fix whether or not the grayling are happy with the temperature that they have. We're talking about stand recovery. And in order to do this, we need to really understand, in our case, how might the leaf area index respond, if we're going to go back to some of those responses, if that's the indicator that we want to use within this process. And that'll remember, salvage, talk to the silviculturalist, which I think we have a pretty good idea on. Right? I hope we do, otherwise, planning departments. And then this idea of what might happen to these different stands, where are they going to go, really comes into play in understanding how might these stands recover. So the answer to your question is we have done it. and we've done it for other purposes. Whether or not we're doing it right, not sure, right? We're doing it, we're trying to relate what might happen if we don't harvest it to a fresh clear cut or to a natural stand, so that we can make a guess to tell Brooks that, okay, yeah, that watershed is tipped over. In 10 years, if you do this treatment, you are going to likely reduce your hazard. That's all we would be doing. Or conversely, if a forest management plan, if mountain pine beetle does continue to rip through Hinton and we're looking at something more severe there, we would definitely be looking at trying to incorporate that information to see what's going on in the landscape outside of the harvest plan. So as a summary, I didn't want to summarize everybody, but there's these general questions that we would be asking. How has the forest condition changed the hydrology? So what is that linkage? There's this weight of evidence that we can hit these watersheds pretty hard, but we're not seeing the response we'd expect. We're not sure exactly what that mechanism is. We can't say watershed A is fine, watershed B you may want to be okay with. They've done a lot of that work in the snow-dominated area, which we are somewhat, but as it relates to this storage component, we can't pick them up and say this one will be bad and this one will be good. So what are those dominant watershed processes? Where is the watershed? Where is the disturbance within the watershed? Is it in an area that's likely going to go into storage or not? The older stuff associated with British Columbia and still used there, is it in that snowmelt zone? Is it, yes, if you go to BC in May, it's sunny, it's great, and the stream's coming up and you can see where the snow is. That's where the snow is. They delineated that and said if you start harvesting up there, you're likely going to impact that. That's where a lot of that came from, and there's these ideas of the hypsometric 60 line and all these other concepts that came out of it. But it was a real management response to something that you could see. What is the forest disturbance and the amount of it? So is your watershed 20% disturbed, 30%, 40%? Brooks sort of mentioned tongue in cheek. He told me that out of his watersheds, only 10% was kind of the maximum amount of mountain pine beetle disturbance that he'd consider severe. Call me later. It's at that level where, from a rehabilitation perspective, you as it relates to hydrology, it's so low that we're not necessarily concerned about it yet. That said, that's then. What might happen in the future, we're not sure. This idea of recovery, so the stands that are out there now, but also this prediction of these new disturbances. And I think this is really going to be the challenge, not only in mountain pine beetle, but wildfire and some of these other aspects, is we've done a lot of really good work on what happens to a stand after we harvest it. And it's the same challenge that the foresters have. We harvest it and plant it, we have a good idea of what we're going to have in 20, 30 years. If we just leave that one alone, what do we have? How do we incorporate that in our yield models? How do we know what's there? Do we walk away from it and say it's nothing? The same as hydrology. The same uncertainty that you have associated with that would be with us trying to figure out what might happen to that recovery.